So I'm much more confident in St. Mary's ability to make it to a Sweet 16 than I am in Gonzaga's. Just because I feel like even if you look at the projected 4 seeds right now, it's Iowa State, UConn, Marquette, and Gonzaga. I don't feel like any of those 4, and Gonzaga wouldn't be in their region. I don't feel like any of the other 3 teams, if St. Mary's were a 5 and those were one of those were the 4 seeds, is really in a position where they're going to overwhelm the Gales.
How's it going, everyone? And welcome back for another episode of the Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. I'm Zach Farmer. We had another really interesting week in the WCC. We're going to get to everything that happened. We'll talk about Gonzaga BYU. We'll get into LMU's win over St. Mary's. We'll also get into a little bit about the absolute mess that is still the middle of this conference. It does feel like the last few weeks we've talked about, we might get some clarity. I still don't know if we do, and we only have 2 more weeks left before the start of the WCC tournament in Las Vegas. We're also going to talk a little bit about in depth about the St. Mary's offense. I mean, we've talked about at least a couple times in the last couple of weeks how like the offense has not been kind of where it had been earlier on this season, and there's definitely the numbers to back it up. So I'll dive into that a little bit more. Connor Hope from Heat Check College Basketball will be checking in with us to kind of go over big picture what we should expect to see from both Gonzaga and St. Mary's moving forward, and then also who has the best shot to, outside of those 2, to maybe get to the championship game in Vegas. Who has that best shot to reach the title game on that Tuesday night? But we're going to start with the chaos for third place. And right now, and again, like this has been the case for the last few weeks, we have another Monday and we have another team who is sitting in third place. Right now, it is Santa Clara at 7-5, but right behind them, you have LMU at 7-6, Pacific at 6-6, BYU, who was in third a week ago, dropped a couple of games, and now they have slid all the way to 6th at 6-7. Then Portland and USF are tied at 5-8, and those are 2 teams as we have been fairly disappointing to this point in conference play. We thought they would play better. Portland, you can point to their injuries. USF just has not had the same level of defense that we saw a year ago. And you could definitely point to a number of reasons why, and chiefly among them being the roster itself. You have a lot of turnover, new head coach. There was a lot of things they were going to make it an uphill challenge for the Dons. And taking a look at all these teams, it was 6 teams within 3 games in the loss column. And now you start to think about, all right, with so few games left, who has maybe the easiest road, who has tiebreakers, who has all of that. And so here's a quick breakdown of just looking at each of their schedules. All right, so we'll start it off looking at, we'll go from the bottom at 5-8 and work our way up. So the two at 5-8, you can look at are USF and Portland. And USF has 3 games left. They're at Pacific this week. This is their only game of the week. Then they are going to be home for Portland and then back on the road at BYU for the WCC finale. Now, right now we look at that USF won actually their first game against BYU. They won their only game against Pacific, and against Portland, that was a loss that they did take. So there's a little bit of a revenge thing there. But USF currently holds 2 tiebreakers against the teams that 2 of the 3 teams they will be playing this week. So maybe a little bit of a leg up for them if they end up in a tiebreaker situation with anyone. Portland has only 1 game this week, but they'll play on Saturday against Santa Clara. Then they are on the road for both USF and Pacific. BYU also only has 3 games left, and they may have the toughest of them all because this week they have both Santa Clara and their home for St. Mary's. They're home for Santa Clara, and they are at St. Mary's this week. Again, maybe the two toughest of the remaining games. And then next week they have one game, which is the finale in Provo against USF. LMU, they have Gonzaga this week on Thursday, which this is going to be another really interesting matchup. This is the one. LMU has, oddly, not too many of the tiebreakers with the teams that they're all kind of in the mix with, because they have wins against Gonzaga and St. Mary's. 2 of their 7 wins belong to 2 of the top 2 teams, which is not something that anybody else in the conference can say. But that means they have to take care of business against the teams that they will potentially have tiebreakers against. And Pacific is going to be chief amongst them. They play each other on Saturday. And then they finish off at Pepperdine. This Pepperdine team has at least been playing a little bit better. They got off that 10-game losing streak. They've won 2 of their last 3, so you can't overlook what Pepperdine has done. Pacific, they have the full slate of 4 games this week. They have USF in Stockton, then they're on the road for 2. They're at LMU, at St. Mary's, and then they're back home for Portland to wrap it up. And Santa Clara's at BYU, at Portland, home for Pepperdine, and then back on the road for San Diego. They have 3 of their last 4 on the road. And this week is going to be especially tough with BYU and Portland. Portland, again, has been playing a lot better as of late. But man, is this going to just be absolute chaos. Like, none of these teams really feel like that they're separating themselves from anyone else. Santa Clara currently does hold 3 tiebreakers at this stage. LMU, oddly enough, only holds 1 tiebreaker against this group, and that's Portland. BYU also, they hold 2. They also have 1 against Portland, and then they hold the tiebreaker against Pacific. Pacific has only 1 tiebreaker, and that's being LMU. USF has, oddly, 3. They hold tiebreakers against LMU, BYU, and Pacific right now. They'll play two of those teams in the next couple weeks. And then Portland, they have 2 tiebreakers, Pacific, USF. And if they have to use a tiebreaker against USF, that's probably going to be for who ends up the 7 or the 8 seed at this stage. I mean, I want to try to look at their schedules, look at the matchups, look at the tiebreaker scenarios, and think, hey, it's like some of these teams may already kind of be locked into where they are, but this is all still too close to be able to tell. Again, with both USF and Portland, who are currently the 7 and 8th place teams at 5 and 8, there's a possibility that USF could win all 3 of their games, and now they're looking at 8 and 8, and maybe they're going to somehow sneak into a scenario where they're going to get a bye at some point throughout the weekend. Again, and the same thing could happen to Portland. Again, they do play each other, so it won't be both of them. One of them has the shot to still be 8 and 8 in conference play, but just looking at the schedules, I mean, Portland probably looks like they're more likely to have that happen than USF. Pacific I think theirs is really tough the rest of the way. That's a team that could end up dropping the next 4 in this stretch, because these are just 4 really tough teams. But an LMU who has had the higher ceiling on the teams they've beaten, I don't know if they can hold serve against the teams below them. That's kind of been one of the problems with LMU to this point. And in Santa Clara, the fact that 3 of their games are on the road makes it really tough. This is going to be just so fascinating watching all of these teams. And for me, thinking about if someone has to have the toughest road, who can sustain through Vegas if they end up dropping further into the standings? LMU just feels like they're built to be able to kind of push through a gauntlet in the WCC tournament. They could be one of those lower seed. They could end up being a 6 seed and win a couple of games, get to the semis, and because they will already have beaten the two teams that are there, we already know St. Mary's is already locked in as a top 2 seed. Gonzaga just needs one more win for them to be locked in as a top 2 seed. That LMU just seems like they have the pieces and they have the depth to be able to kind of combat that. BYU has just been so inconsistent offensively. I don't know if I trust them. Santa Clara, they've been so they can be inconsistent on the defensive end, and they don't always have someone to help out Pajemski and Stewart on the offensive end. Portland, if they shoot well, they're in it. Same with USF. Pacific, they have to make it ugly for them to have a chance. If they let teams get into a rhythm, it ends up being a long night for them. So this is going to be just an absolute dogfight. We knew this was going to be the case with all these teams. We knew that all these teams were going to just bludgeon each other, and they have. They got 7-5, 7-6, 6-6, 6-7, 5-8, 5-8. No one has really separated themselves, and we only have a few weeks left. Those bottom 2 teams, whichever teams those end up being, are going to play in that opening round on Thursday. And really the goal for any of these teams is like that you don't want to have to play until Friday or Saturday. You can somehow slide into those 3-4 slots. I think you're going to be sitting pretty with the rest of what the conference is going to have to go through. LMU does seem like they're the best fit to survive having to play more games, but we'll see. Long way to go. We're going to talk a little bit more about LMU because, again, like we talked about, like they beat St. Mary's and then they went ahead and lost to Santa Clara on Saturday. So I want LMU almost to kind of start to get on a run here and really kind of like not validate, because I think there has been plenty of validation for what LMU has done, beating both Gonzaga and St. Mary's and BYU. The only team now to have actually beaten all 3 of them in the same season, and will be the only one ever to have beaten all 3 of them in the same season, now with BYU heading to the Big 12. All right, and with that, I'm going to transition into my big 3, and I'll stick there, and I'll stay with LMU. Cam Shelton, Cam Shelton I think he is making a stronger and stronger case. He won WCC Player of the Week this Monday. He is making a strong case to be WCC Player of the Year. And I know a lot of times that it ends up being the totality of the season. You start to think about what happened in the non-conference and everything else. And that's a harder sell to include Cam Shelton on that. But you think about what he has been able to do in WCC play, the fact that he has wins against St. Mary's and Gonzaga, in which he was the reason the Lions won in each of those games. He is, in conference play alone, he is first in scoring. He is third in assists. He is fifth in steals. Yes, he's not the most efficient scorer, but he is, in crunch time, in late in game scenarios, he is throwing his team on his back and carrying them to these victories, to these games. Like, it's incredible to kind of see what we've seen from Cam Shelton to this point. And I think we have to talk about just like that he has to be in this conversation. He has to be part of the conversation for WCC Player of the Year. I know that right now, like, I've talked with a number of people and it's still like Drew Timme. And consistently across the board, he's the most efficient scorer in the league. He is still the best. He may still be the best player in the league, but you're talking about importance to your team, coming through when it matters most. Man, and especially considering he has one more shot against Gonzaga on Thursday, if he has another stellar performance against the Zags, considering the roster he's on, the expectation of what LMU was supposed to be, it's gonna the case is just going to get stronger and stronger that Cam Shelton should be getting some votes for WCC Player of the Year. That was unreal the other night against St. Mary's. I think it was like he was scoreless in the first half, and so all 31 of his points were in the second half and in overtime. And in overtime, he was incredible. I mean, we talked about how incredible Aiden Mahaney was against Gonzaga down the stretch of that game. Cam Shelton took that to another level, and he's just so tough. Can finish at the rim in a number of ways. It's really impressive to see what he's been able to do over the last few weeks, and all conference schedule, all conference play. Like Cam Shelton just been great. And in that game against St. Mary's, there were a few things. Like St. Mary's jumped out to that 16-0 lead, and I definitely thought at that point, it's like, well, St. Mary's is just going to roll this game. It looked like that they were just going to completely run away from them, and St. Mary's hit one of those offensive lulls, and LMU just kept chipping away and chipping away and chipping away, and slowly crawled their way back into it. They are a team who is oddly equipped to really play a tough style against both St. Mary's and Gonzaga. Again, we saw this in both of these games where what LMU did was disrupt both teams' offenses. They disrupted what Gonzaga wanted to do. They disrupted what St. Mary's wanted to do. They're a good defensive team. Like, they are a solid, versatile defensive team because a lot of their guys can guard multiple positions. They are a team that does have some rim protection, which obviously helps against both of these teams. You have guys on both of them who want to try to get to the rim. Having a rim protector against Drew Timme is always helpful. Having a rim protector when you have like Logan Johnson trying to get to the bucket is always helpful. And I don't think you can say enough about how LMU and Stan Johnson has really kind of instilled just this extra level of fortitude and confidence that this team has. And because you see just like how unrattled it seems that they are in close games down the stretch. They could have very easily let the Gonzaga game get away from them in front of the Kennel at the Kennel Club and have all of that really impact how they played and getting too excited and everything else. And they were just poised. Something Cam Shelton brought up a few weeks back, how poised they were. They had to have poise against St. Mary's the other night. They had to have poise to climb back into that. And then also in front of their own crowd, not to get too excited and too overhyped. It could have been very easy to start to do a little too much against that St. Mary's team. And you cannot make mistakes against that St. Mary's team, this St. Mary's team. So I thought that was just a really impressive night for them. And I thought was also impressive, and we were starting to see a few more teams start to do this, is make Aiden Mahaney a volume shooter, make life more difficult on Mahaney. It really is like it's make him a volume shooter, or it's take the ball out of his hands. Do not let him create and do something with it. And that was maybe he had 24 points in that LMU game, and that was a quiet 24 points. You really didn't hear much from him late in that game. Obviously, that's because Logan Johnson took over offensively for St. Mary's, and for a while it was just Cam Shelton and Logan Johnson going back and forth, bucket for bucket. It's just incredible to kind of see how teams are starting to adjust and how LMU really was able to utilize that. And we're starting to see a little bit more and more of how teams are strategizing for Mahaney and everything else. And so I'm going to transition to kind of like my point number 2, talking about the St. Mary's offense, because we are starting to see a little bit more of that strategy. And St. Mary's in general has just not been as efficient offensively over the last few weeks. Talked about that against USF. Talked about that against BYU, against Gonzaga, against LMU. Just looking at the numbers, so the St. Mary's is shooting about 46% from the field for the season. And in the last, in the last 5 games, they have shot below their season average all but one time. And that includes a 32% performance against USF, a 41% performance against LMU. They have not been shooting the 3 nearly as well over that same stretch. Now, Portland aside, like they lit up Portland from 3 the other day, 15 for 32. But 23% against USF, 25% against Gonzaga, 31% against LMU. This team has not played as well as we're used to seeing them play. And a lot of that, I think this has to do with going through second round of conference play. Like teams are starting to adjust. Teams are starting to make changes on how you attack this offense. And that's where we started to see, that was where Aiden Mahaney was really actually thriving, was early in conference play, first time around. No one had seen him. So he was able to actually almost get exactly what he wanted, get where he wanted, and it was working really well. And over the last 2 games, it's not that he's still not being fairly efficient, but it is definitely to the point of it's making it harder, make someone else other than him beat you. Remember that at one point in the Gonzaga game, he was something like 1 for 11 before really going off in the last like 4 minutes of the game. He was 8 for 21 against LMU. He only took 9 shots against Portland. Teams are trying to force it out of his hands a little bit more, and it does seem like that defenses are focusing a little bit more. Even in that first half against USF, even though he ended up having a really good game, the strategy changed. In the first game against USF, they really kind of let Mahaney get what he wanted, and in the second game in that first half, there was an emphasis on attacking him on the ball. Shabazz was all over him in that first half. He ended up actually figuring it out in the second half. But teams are trying to figure out something you can do with this offense, because you're not going to get this team rattled on defense. It is very rare, again, LMU aside, because that was a great performance by the Lions. You're not going to get this St. Mary's team to get out of its game on the defensive end. The only way you can really try to attack this team is on the offense, and forcing them to make uncomfortable shots, take more uncomfortable looks. Because you really only have like maybe 2 playmakers on that offense. That's Mahaney and Logan Johnson. And Logan Johnson is not that good of an outside shooter. You're almost willing to let him take that outside shot. Force him to take those, try to keep the ball out of Mahaney's hands. Because the other 3, Bowen, Dukas, and Saxon, are great in their roles, but they're not going to be that guy at the end of a shot clock who's going to take your guy off the basket and find and create for themselves. That's just not who they are. And that is something that they're going to have to obviously get better at if they're going to go deeper into the NCAA tournament and everything else, go deeper even into the WCC tournament. They're going to have to be better on the offensive end if they're going to win in Spokane. Still got a couple weeks until then. They've got to start to work it better. And the game against Portland was a much better performance. So I think that was really optimistic to see how the offense looked. But they're going to need that against BYU, on Saturday because this BYU is one of the better defensive teams in the conference. They're still a top 30 defense in the country, so the offense needs to be on point for them to get over the hump against the Cougars in the final meeting in Moraga as WCC opponents. And speaking of BYU, we got to talk about the game in Spokane. And I thought this was a game in which Gonzaga did very well there late in the second half. I expected this game to be back and forth most of the game, and it was. Like, this was, especially that second half, it was BYU got a bucket, Gonzaga got a bucket, BYU got a bucket, Gonzaga got a bucket. Spencer Johnson hits a big shot. Then you get something from Timmy. You got great performance from Fustra Ori. I thought he was really good in the second half. You get clutch shots from Julian Strother over and over again. You got big shots from Ashir Bolton. Like, this was another chapter in that rivalry between these two. The final WCC trip for BYU to Spokane. And it lived up to all that hype. But Gonzaga was able to play good enough defense down the stretch, forced BYU into some bad offense, and really took advantage of them late in that second half. I think it was like they outscored them down the stretch 20-10. And it's another good win. It's another game where Gonzaga looks like they're starting to play a little bit more back on track to what we're used to seeing. And just another heartbreaker for BYU. They still have yet to lose a single conference game by double digits. They're 6-7, and they just cannot figure out how to get over the hump in some of these games. And for Gonzaga, I think that, again, this was a good sign again, getting this game, another rivalry game. You check that off, and you keep the pressure on St. Mary's, because now with the loss to LMU, like, they're back in the hunt to reclaim a regular season championship with only a few games to go. And now that they have the same loss, the game in Spokane in a couple of weeks really is going to be a make or break for who's going to be the 1 seed in Vegas. And I don't think it necessarily, grand scheme of things, is going to make a whole lot of difference for the 1 seed in Vegas based on the way the rest of the conference is played. I think most everyone is kind of almost in the same boat that I don't think for Gonzaga or St. Mary's it matters 1 or 2. Where this matters is potential seeding for the NCAA tournament. That second game against Gonzaga, if St. Mary's wins another game against Gonzaga, that's potentially going to bump them up on a seed line and keep them somewhere. We'll talk a little bit. I'm gonna get into that with Connor a little bit. And for Gonzaga, it really is like kind of restamping your dominance on the conference, that this is your conference and that everything goes through Spokane. If they are able to win out, St. Mary's wins out, and the game on the 25th is the game that is going to put Gonzaga potentially back into a share of the regular season title. It's almost, for St. Mary's, it's almost like it's the one they let slip away, because you could point to maybe they let the game against LMU slip away. And maybe that impacts Vegas, maybe it doesn't, but that could be something that almost is an added incentive item, I think, for the Zags going in, now that they know there's a shot. They can win the regular season title still, even with, like we talked about, like, oh, they're not playing as well, they're not doing this, they're not doing that. And here they are once again in position to win the WCC regular season title. All right. So now we'll go ahead and get into it with Connor. We'll talk some Zags and Gales, and we'll just go ahead and bring him on in. All right, we're going to bring in Connor Hope. He's one of the co-hosts of the Heat Check podcast. So, Connor, let's talk about Zags and Gales here, because these two teams have been up. We know that they're the 1-2 in the conference, regardless of how it ends up finishing out, whether they end up sharing the regular season title or not. They're going to be playing. They won't play till Monday in the WCC tournament. What can these two do to help their resume, to stand pat? What sort of movement? Because it seems like right now we've seen them kind of stuck on that 4-5 line, and that's more or less where they've been for the last few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, not much. Don't lose to anybody else in the conference, right? They both lost to LMU. Gonzaga's loss obviously is going to be viewed worse than St. Mary's loss just based on the location. But if you win the games you're supposed to, you go into that final game, where I guess the final game for St. Mary's, the second to last game for Gonzaga, the game between the two of them in Spokane, without another blemish on your resume, you're pretty much guaranteed, I feel like, the 4-5. The only thing that might change that is if St. Mary's is still viewed as kind of a 5 seed, and then they lose both subsequent games to Gonzaga, they might drop to a 6. But I think they're pretty much, as long as they don't get upset, I think they're pretty much guaranteed one of those kind of 4 through 6 spots on the bracket. The WCC tournament is conducive to that, right? They only have to win one game in Vegas to not lose to the other team, assuming the other team also wins that game. So, it's just a matter of, again, just don't get upset. If you don't get upset, you go into that final game against each other. You go into the championship game in Vegas. I feel like 6 would be the lowest that either would drop, but both are pretty much guaranteed to be on that 4-5 line. If Gonzaga goes undefeated, could they sneak into a 3 line? It would take a lot, maybe. But I think St. Mary's ceiling is probably a 4. Gonzaga's is probably a 3, and the floor for both of them is probably a 6.
I mean, and you talk about winning out, because honestly, it's looked a little bit more challenging for both teams, especially considering who you kind of take a look at the schedule. St. Mary's really had their offense has kind of been a little on the low side the last few weeks. Gonzaga has had some close calls. Gonzaga's at LMU this week, and St. Mary's is hosting BYU. These are maybe I think the 2 last real challenging hiccups that either team could face. It's how do you look at either of those games, and is there a chance that there's a potential slip up from either of them here?
I think the potential slip up is probably more Gonzaga than it is St. Mary's. St. Mary's, and I said it a couple weeks ago when Gonzaga lost to St. Mary's, right? St. Mary's is too efficient to be inefficient against. And BYU has a tendency, especially on offense, to be inefficient. I believe they're the second to worst offense in the conference per the efficiency metrics. That's not going to beat St. Mary's, right? And to beat St. Mary's, you have to have one of two things. You have to be either incredibly efficient or you have to be incredibly athletic, neither of which fits BYU all that well. So they're a team that's looked good against Gonzaga, especially from 3. And I feel like that's really where they've made it close, right? They're a team that shoots I think 32% on the season from 3. They've shot over 60%, if I remember correctly, in the 2 games combined against Gonzaga. But outside of that, their wins in WCC play are Pacific, Portland, San Diego, Pepperdine, and then they have the home win against LMU. They're not a team that I'm worried about as St. Mary's. LMU, on the other hand, has beaten both Gonzaga and St. Mary's already. Do I think Gonzaga loses twice to the same team that's not St. Mary's? No. But Cam Shelton has put himself squarely in the mix as, not player of the year, because that's going to Timmy or Mahaney, but squarely in the mix as probably the best player or the best option behind those top 2 teams to win player of the year, simply because he and Pods are around the same in terms of their counting stats. Shelton might be a little bit less efficient, but Shelton has those 2 big wins. So LMU, I'm a little bit more scared about, also because Gonzaga has a tendency to play inefficient basketball for really long stretches in games. But I'm not worried about BYU for St. Mary's, especially since it's a home game.
So, which of these teams, St. Mary's or Gonzaga, looking forward, looking down the road, has maybe the best shot at a deeper run in the tournament? And for both of these teams, what if things go wrong? What's going to be their undoing once we get to March?
I'm much more confident in St. Mary's ability to win 2 games than Gonzaga's. So I'm much more confident in St. Mary's ability to make it to a Sweet 16 than I am in Gonzaga's. Just because I feel like even if you look at the projected 4 seeds right now, it's Iowa State, UConn, Marquette, and Gonzaga. I don't feel like any of those 4, and Gonzaga wouldn't be in their region. I don't feel like any of the other 3 teams, if St. Mary's were a 5 and those were one of those were the 4 seeds, is really in a position where they're going to overwhelm the Gales. And again, St. Mary's, one of the most efficient teams in the country, right? And they have players who can make plays. They play really solid defense. And I don't think that their efficiency fluctuates, right? So they're pretty steady Eddie, except for that kind of late November, early December run that they had where they had 3 losses and then they lost at home to Colorado State a couple weeks later. For Gonzaga, I think they have the players, they have the personnel to make a deeper run, right? I don't think St. Mary's is a Final Four contender. I don't think Gonzaga is either, but I think if one of those 2 teams were to make that run, it would be Gonzaga. But they're primed for an earlier round upset because they play really well and it dips, or they play really poorly at the beginning of games and they can come back against WCC talent, but they're not, if you put them up against, say they're a 4 seed and you put them up against a TCU or a Miami or an Indiana who are on the 5 line, like those are teams that Gonzaga probably should beat. But if you give them a 10-point lead early in the game, I'm not sure that they are going to miss enough shots down the stretch to allow Gonzaga back in the game. So I think Gonzaga has the better personnel. Hickman, when he's on, is really good. Strother's looked really good as of late. Obviously, we all know who Drew Timme is. Anton Watson can match up with most 4s or 5s in the country, with the exception of kind of like an Edey or a Baycott, maybe even a Baycott, right? He played pretty well against Sheway, but I don't trust them in earlier round games as much as I trust St. Mary's to actually play the part of where they fit in the grand scheme of where they're ranked right now.
Right, so St. Mary's better shot for Sweet 16, but better shot at a Final Four. Even though it's not that great, it's still Gonzaga because of the talent and everything else. And honestly, I kind of agree with that assessment. It's like that. Yeah, Gonzaga has the greater upside, but they also have the greater potential for an upset earlier on. So, I mean, going back to the WCC and looking at the races that are going on, we have a lot of a jumble here in the middle, like from 3 to 9 still, actually, well, 3 to 8. You have 6 teams who are all still separated by all of like 3 in the loss column. Santa Clara right now is in 3rd, but in the last week it's been BYU or LMU in that spot. I think even Pacific actually shared it for a hot second there a few weeks ago, which may be the biggest shocker of them all, that Pacific's been in that position. How are you kind of like looking at the rest of how league is going to play out, and maybe and we talked a little bit about it, just the impression of like how impressive LMU has been in those wins that they've been able to pick up, obviously like BYU, St. Mary's, Gonzaga, but then also on the flip side, they'll lose to teams maybe they shouldn't be losing to. Yeah,
I think it kind of plays out the way you not necessarily would expect, right? San Francisco, Portland being towards the bottom in favor of LMU Pacific is not the way you saw it playing out. But you've got Gonzaga and St. Mary's at the top. You've got the 2 teams with the next 2 best players in the league at 3 and 4, right? Santa Clara and Loyola Marymount. If you were to take a the top team players in the country. You take the players off St. Mary's and Gonzaga, then you take Podzimski and you take Shelton.
Yeah,
and those would be the next two best players, right? The two players that are playing the best basketball right now at 3 and 4. Pacific is a weird one because I feel like last year, I don't want to call it an outlier, but I think Leonard Perry had a little bit of that. He was still playing the assistant coach role a little bit. Wasn't really able to instill his style. But they play some gritty basketball. I mean, similar to the Damon Stoudemire teams. Like, they just play some hard-nosed basketball. Defensively, not so great. But on the offensive end, they don't turn the ball over a ton. They shoot the ball well from 3. It's kind of get your own shot. And look, they have a win over LMU. They have a win over Santa Clara on the road. The rest of their schedule has been pretty much what you would have expected preseason, right? They lost to the BYU, Portland, San Francisco, Santa Clara, and Gonzaga. So down the stretch, I think is going to make or break them as a top half team. They have the home games against San Francisco and Portland, which they should be able to win, but San Francisco they're a talented team that's just not performing at that level. So we'll see where that goes. But they have 2 really tough road games. I almost called them losses because I think they'll lose those games, but LMU and St. Mary's right in the middle of that. And the way it's kind of gone is they've lost in bunches. And so if they start losing, I feel like it's going to be 2 or 3 in a row. Which would put them probably around 7 and 9, maybe 8 and 8. But I feel like 8 and 8 would be the ceiling for them, this season.
I mean, Pacific is really just so interesting, and I go back and I think about that the game they had against Gonzaga because honestly, because I was coming off the Gonzaga's loss to LMU, and I'm definitely one of those people who thinks I feel sorry for the team who plays Gonzaga next after they lose a game because I feel like they usually come out on fire and really ready to rip. And Pacific hung in there with them most of that game and kept it close for most of it. And hell, they scored 90 against the Zags, which again, for this Pacific team, they're not world beaters on the offensive end, but I felt like it just showed, to your point, how much grit that team has. I don't think there are going to be many teams that run away from Pacific, even as we get into the tournament.
No, and I think for Pacific too, I don't want to ever call 3-point shooting luck, especially on the offensive end. On the defensive end, there's an element to it, right? They're 4th in the conference in 3-point shooting defense behind the top 3 defenses in the conference, which would be St. Mary's, BYU, and LMU. On offense, Gonzaga's number 2 in 3-point shooting at 38.6%. Pacific's number 1. They're shooting the best 3-point ball of any team in this conference, which I feel like has helped them, especially since they shoot the 3 ball at a relatively decent rate, probably slightly above average. So in terms of number of 3-point shots per game. So they're shooting the 3 ball a lot, and they're shooting the 3 ball well, and I think that's helped them, considering all of their wins have been with them scoring in the 80s or 90s. So they've won really high scoring games, which when you get up against the St. Mary's or even an LMU, I don't know if you're going to win those games, but they've won some really high scoring games, so they can put the ball in the basket.
All right, so before I let you go, before we get out of here, I'm gonna ask for picks on 2 different things. So first one is going to be who amongst the non-top 2, the rest of the conference, who has the best shot to make an appearance in that title game in Vegas, and then of the likely 2 who are going to be there, the St. Mary's and Gonzaga, who's going to be that auto bid? Because I feel like this is maybe the most wide open year it's been in a while.
that's a tough one. So I think it's going to be of the non ones. I think it's Santa Clara. I think Santa Clara and LMU end up tying for third. Santa Clara has the tiebreaker against LMU with their win on Saturday, and I think that the best shot is knocking off Gonzaga. Again, I just think the floor for St. Mary's is so high. But I think Gonzaga is the more vulnerable one to losing games they shouldn't. So I'm going to say that Santa Clara is probably the best shot at making the title game, which I guess means that St. Mary's has the best shot at winning the auto bid. But I don't know. I think we're going to have to see that game in Spokane to see how Gonzaga reacts. Because remember, Gonzaga controlled that game for close to 30 minutes, maybe even more, and then just couldn't make shots, couldn't stop Mahaney, right? If they control the game in Spokane legitimately from tip to finish, then you're talking about something else. Again, it's whoever plays Gonzaga, so it's either Santa Clara or LMU. Whoever plays Gonzaga in that semifinals. But I feel like we could see a situation in which Gonzaga proves their I don't even want to say superiority, but proves that they have the talent and the athleticism to beat St. Mary's from tip to finish in Spokane. In which case, when you get to Vegas, they now have the blueprint, right? And I feel like Gonzaga turns things, well, both Gonzaga and St. Mary's, but I feel like Vegas kind of turns something on in both those teams where, even if they struggled with teams earlier on in the year, they kind of handle business in Vegas. So we'll see.
Yeah. And no one but St. Mary's and Gonzaga have won in Vegas since they've moved the tournament to the Orleans. So it'll be exciting to see. Connor, thanks for hopping on. Thanks for talking some WCC hoops with us, and we'll catch up down the road.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Again, I want to thank Connor for hopping on the podcast and sharing his thoughts on Gonzaga, St. Mary's, and where the WCC is right now. You can find him on Twitter at HopesHoopsCBB. And I think what was really interesting is that he talked about the idea of St. Mary's being the safer bet to make a Sweet 16, but that Gonzaga is the better bet to go deep into the tournament. And I kind of agree with him on that. And I agree with the reasons that he gave. I think St. Mary's is a safer bet because they make fewer mistakes. They are more consistent. You know what you're going to get from St. Mary's on a night in, night out basis. And that is going to that's going to give you some consistency and probably get you to weekend number 2. And we've seen Gonzaga be too inconsistent throughout the course of the season for you to believe that they're more likely to be upset early on than I think St. Mary's is. And then to that point of, if Gonzaga is consistent in any stretch and can play, especially on the defensive end, more consistently, get something more from offensively than just Drew Timme on a night in, night out basis, which they will need in the NCAA tournament. We know Strother can perform on the bigger stages. We've seen it in the past. We know Malachi Smith has performed really well on the biggest stage in the NCAA tournament. They have the talent to get deeper into the tournament. And obviously we know matchups and everything else. So we'll see how all that goes. But yeah, I largely agree with where Connor was going with that. I think that we're looking at a St. Mary's team who is primed to reach, who is a safe bet to go back to the Sweet 16 for the first time since 2010. Gonzaga, maybe the first time in, I think it's 7 straight years they've reached the NCAA, the Sweet 16. So this is probably as high a risk as Gonzaga will have been at to not make that second weekend. And also interesting to note that the the talk about who could potentially get to that from the others in the WCC, who could get to that championship game. That's not who's the most likely to knock off St. Mary's or Gonzaga, and to me, it does feel like it's actually ISIL. I'm going to ride with LMU on that front. I think that they've proven they can beat both of them. And that Gonzaga, and this is where I also agree with Connor, it's that Gonzaga still does seem like the one who, if you're going to lose, if one of the two is going to lose in Vegas, that's the team that's going to lose in Vegas. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to see St. Mary's Gonzaga in the title game. No other team other than St. Mary's, Gonzaga, and BYU have even reached the championship game in Las Vegas. And the last team to do it was in 2000 at all. Pre-Vegas, you had to go back all the way to 2008 when it was San Diego in the title game. And all right, so taking a look at the schedule, and there are some key matchups, and I think like the ones to highlight are definitely going to be BYU's week is going to be a tough week. I think both their games you really have to circle and see how is BYU going to come out of this. They have St. Mary's, they start with Santa Clara on Thursday in Provo, and then they travel to Moraga to take on St. Mary's on Saturday. Both of those matchups are going to be really challenging for BYU. This BYU team is a good defensive team. It's a matter of whether or not they can get enough offense. They did lose the first matchup with Santa Clara, so this is a little bit of a revenge game. Last opportunity for Santa Clara to also win in Provo. So that's also something else to keep an eye on. And then for the St. Mary's game, last we saw, this was Aiden Mahaney's first national stage busting out party with his game winner up in the Marriott Center. I think BYU's week is going to be really interesting. You have to keep an eye on LMU. They host Gonzaga on Thursday. And typically, I usually think after a loss, the Zags usually come out strong. And I'm sure that they're putting up every last bit of bulletin board material to remind themselves of everything that has come out after they lost to LMU, every last clip of what they did wrong in that game, every last clip of what LMU did right in that game. Cam Shelton, we know, is going to be the focal point of the scouting report. And so I think for LMU, it's going to be key for them to find someone else. Someone else has to come through in those clutch moments, and it can't always be Cam Shelton, even though he has been so successful in those moments the last month and a half. And then maybe a low-key matchup to kind of keep an eye on is Pacific and USF. This is, I think, going to be an opportunity for both of them, because I think for USF, they need to beat Pacific. This is a must-win for them if they hope to stay out of the opening round. It's their only game this week. The other two are Portland and BYU. And if they don't come away with this one, it adds more pressure to have to do it next week. And for Pacific, this is maybe with this game being in Stockton, and thus also their finale being in Stockton against Portland, those two are probably the most important, the easiest to get for the Tigers. I mean, this last four-game stretch is going to be critical for them, but I could very easily see them going 0-4 in this last go-round. You have USF or at LMU, at St. Mary's, and then home for Portland. They can beat. I think they have the capability of beating 3 of those 4. They've already beaten LMU, but they've got to show it. And I think this is going to be a critical time for Pacific. They're 6-6 right now, so we'll see how that all plays out. All right. Well, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and TikTok at Post by Zach. Be sure to subscribe on the YouTube channel. And then also be sure to like and share the podcast with your friends, family, other WCC fans on your favorite streaming service. Have a good week, everybody, and I will catch you next time.